What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome back. It is a new year of Call to Communion here on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. We are live on this Wednesday, January 2nd. We would love to hear from you. Tell us your story. Tell us why you're not a Catholic yourself. This is a program specifically for non-Catholics. Maybe you were a Catholic as a kid and you stepped away in college or during high school or whenever, but now you're thinking about the Catholic Church again. Maybe family members went to the solemnity of Mary, Mother of God, yesterday, Holy Day of Obligation. You're thinking, gee, I used to do that myself. Maybe I need to find out more about this Catholic faith of mine, that used to be mine. Or maybe you've never been a Catholic. Well, this might be your year. Give us a call, 833-288-EWTN. Tell us why you're not a Catholic, 833-288-3986. Or you may have a question or two about the Catholic faith, and we can hopefully clear that up for you as well. If you're listening to us outside of North America, you'll want to dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Got to put that in. It's a legal thing. Again, our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Rich Jesse, of all people, is our producer today, giving me the old thumbs up, so this is a good thing. We also have Ryan Penny handling phone screening and Jeff Burson on social media. You can also ask your questions via Facebook or YouTube. I'm Tom Price, welcoming Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Doing great. Happy New Year to you, my friend.
Happy New Year to you.
Did you welcome the new year in style, with the noisemakers and all that?
Well, I have a noisemaker, but it's the kind that you get from Hammock or Schlimmer, and you play it all night long to drown out all the other sounds so you can sleep soundly.
Oh, that's funny. Like a white noise generator?
Yes, a white noise generator. So I put my white noise generator on at about, 9:45 and went to bed.
I love it. Okay, I think he's on to something. We'll get some of these questions screened as quickly as we can. Ryan Penny is handling that. Here right now, though, is an email that we received. Can't quite tell the name here, but this says, my 3-year-old granddaughter's mother wants her baptized, but she only has me, who is a faithful Catholic, in her life. Could I be her godfather, and what are the other requirements?
Okay, thanks. So it sounds like, let's see, the mother wants the child baptized, but the mother is not a practicing Catholic? Is that the implication?
My 3-year-old granddaughter's mother, okay, so that would be their daughter, I guess, wants her baptized, but she only has me, who is a faithful Catholic, in her life. Could I be the godfather?
Oh, okay, all right. So it sounds like the child's parent wants the child to be baptized, but the parent is not herself a faithful Catholic.
Correct.
Yes, you can have a child baptized under those circumstances, provided there is someone in the child's life who's willing to take on the moral responsibility of seeing that the child is raised in the faith. That's the Church wants to baptize people.
Okay.
We're about baptizing.
All
Baptizing is how we are initiated into the grace of God. But the Church is not going to baptize a child unless the parents or someone is willing to step up and say, we will take on the obligations to see that the child is brought up in the Catholic way of life. Otherwise, you're initiating somebody into the Church, and then you're just leaving them on the doorstep. You're not actually teaching them how to live a Catholic life.
That would not be good.
So you got to do that. You got to have somebody who's willing to take that responsibility. And you talk it through with your parish priest, but if you're willing to make that commitment, I believe the Church would allow the child to be baptized, provided that you're the one that takes on that responsibility.
Very good. Here's one now from Frederick, who says, Merry Christmas, Dr. Anders. Today, after morning Mass, a group of us gathered for breakfast, and the question came up for the priest with us, why does the Church celebrate St. Stephen, St. John, and the Holy Innocents immediately following Christmas Day? Did the Church arrange as such with a purpose in mind? Thanks for your time, and P.S. Your show is fantastic. God bless, Frederick.
Thanks, Frederick. I appreciate the question. So if you are familiar with the show, you know that the questions that I am most likely to punt or demur are those regarding the rationale for the liturgical calendar.
Yeah.
And this will continue to be one of those instances. I would love to tell you that I knew the rationale for every feast day in the calendar. I don't. So I don't know.
Okay. So, Frederick, if you're listening to us on this day after New Year's, you may want to resubmit your question to our friend Colin Donovan for Open Line Friday, or to Father Mitch Pacwa on Open Line Wednesday. A couple of good possibilities for you there. Here's one more now, and this is from Dominic. 2 quick questions. How or why did the Church join Christ and the Mass to come up with the word Christmas? What is the meaning of the phrase in the first letter of St. John that states, "He is expiation for our sins"? Thanks. Enjoy the education you two provide. Dominic.
Okay. First question. I'm gonna punt twice in a row here. I don't know the etymology.
All right.
So I just don't know. I'm sorry, I can't tell
Okay.
you.
All right.
And with respect to, what was the second question?
The second question is, what is the meaning of the phrase in the first letter of St. John that states, "He is expiation for our sins"?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. John tells us also in the second chapter that that Christ's death is expiation in the mode of a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
All right, sacrifice expiates sins. St. Paul tells us that Jesus' death on the cross was a sacrifice of atonement. Similar metaphor, and of course the book of Hebrews likens the death of Christ to the fulfillment of all the old covenant sacrifices that could be offered to make atonement for sin. So that's the model that we have to use to interpret the significance of Jesus' death. What happens when a worshiper offers a sacrifice to God? What's transpiring there? And the essence of sacrifice is that the worshiper is giving up something of value. The worshiper is giving up something of value. So an Israelite might give up a cow or a goat or a sheep from his flock, might give up some aspect of agricultural produce. There was even provisions for grain offerings that could be made. Perhaps, a bird, turtle doves, pigeons, whatever it might be, some article of value the worshiper gives up. King David speaks about this in 2 Samuel 24 when he's given the opportunity. Someone offers him a bull to offer in sacrifice, and he says, no, I'm going to pay for this thing because I refuse to offer the Lord a sacrifice that costs me nothing.
Right.
And when we do that, we atone for or expiate or make reparation for sin. Just like if you offend somebody and you can come and bring them a gift and say, I'm sorry, and look, in token of my sincerity, here's this gift that I give you. That's what brings the value to the sacrifice. In Jesus' case, he gave up the value of his own human life, a sacrifice of infinite value.
There we go. All right. Tomorrow morning, it's Catholic Answers. No, not Catholic Answers. Catholic Connection with our friend Teresa Tomeo. And she'll be joined by Jeannie Mancini, sharing the plans for the upcoming March for Life 2019. We were blessed to go to the March last year, 2018. It was fantastic. I cannot recommend it highly enough. So if you want to find out more about it, do check it out tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN's Catholic Connection. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Eric in Antioch, Illinois, listening on WSFI. Eric, Merry Christmas to you. What's on your mind today?
Merry Christmas, gentlemen. My question involves a friend of mine that was baptized in the Catholic Church and never really grew up in the church due to his mom passing away. I think she was the only one that really practiced her faith. So he was never really convinced at this point as an adult that convicted by conscience that the Catholic Church is the true church. However, my question is, for those that are not convicted of the church being the true church, but have been baptized, are they still bound to canonical form?
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So when you speak of being bound to canonical form, at first I thought you were going to ask me about the canonical form of baptism, but now it seems to mean are they considered by the church to be Catholics who are bound to uphold all of the obligations of Catholic life? Is that what you mean by the question?
Yeah, I was more specifying marriage, but I guess it would involve everything.
Oh, sure. So from the point of view of the Catholic Church, for a Catholic to have a valid marriage, one must subscribe to canonical form, and that would be true in your friend's case also. Now, obviously, if your friend does not regard the Catholic Church as the church founded by Jesus, and does not recognize that he has an obligation to live in accord with the church's teaching or with its instructions for marriage, it is very unlikely that he is going to follow those directions in contracting his marriage. So how do we regard his marriage then in its interior, in the essence of his marriage? What's going on when he makes his vows to his wife if it's not a canonically valid marriage? Well, it's not going to be a valid marriage, and it's certainly not going to be a valid sacrament. And so if it's not a valid sacrament, then there's no objective promise of divine grace specifically pertinent to that sacrament that we can rely on. We won't be able to look at that relationship and say, yes, there is a valid sacrament there. Yes, God is giving grace for him to meet the arduous demands of Christian marriage. Yes, his marriage is going to be a pattern of Christ's love for the church, and on and on and on. It's not going to have that character. Does that mean that God has thereby abandoned him? No, we can't draw that judgment. We don't know what secrets God might work in his heart or in his wife's heart, and how he may bring them to himself. We don't know that. What we do know is that they will not have a canonically valid sacramental marriage. That doesn't mean that God has cast them off and there's no hope for them. But as Catholics, our attitude should be to attempt incrementally, small steps. We'll take what progress we can to bring our friends as close to the church, as close to Christ, and as close to the truth about God as we can get them, because that's what's in their objective best interest.
Right.
But we're going to let God judge the soul. We're not going to cast them away, and we're not going to consign them to the outer darkness. We're going to love them and try to bring them closer and closer into the heart of the church and to the church's teaching. But when it comes to the question of judging their interior life, we're going to leave that up to God.
Absolutely. Eric, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. What's keeping you from becoming a Catholic? We would love to know, and let's discuss it a little bit. It's called a communion here on EWTN. 833-288-EWTN is our phone number. Here's an email from Christine in Buffalo. She says, Dr. Andrews, please explain the following from Matthew 22, verses 41 through 45. Then, surrounded by the Pharisees, Jesus asked them a question. What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? They replied, he is the son of David. Jesus responded, then why does David, speaking under the inspiration of the Spirit, call the Messiah my Lord? For David said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit in the place of honor at my right hand until I humble your enemies beneath your feet. So, since David called the Messiah my Lord, how can the Messiah be his son? Again, that's from Christine in Buffalo.
Okay, you want commentary on that passage.
Yeah.
Okay, certainly. So we know from the Old Testament that the Messiah would be born a lineal descendant of King David. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, God promises David that he will never fail to have an heir on the throne of Israel. And in other places we learn that this messianic figure who'll come at the end of time will be in this lineal descent from King David. So that's what he means by the Messiah is going to be David's son.
Oh, okay.
Now, Psalm 110, from which Jesus quotes, is often understood to be a messianic psalm. This Davidic king who reigns over Israel is understood to be a messianic figure. And Jesus, taking for granted that this psalm was penned by David, places in the mouth of David these words, "The Lord said to my Lord." And Jesus asks us, well, how is that possible? How is it that King David, who ostensibly penned this psalm, would refer to his own progeny in this superior way, as a superior? And obviously, it's meant to provoke the conclusion that the Messiah is more than a mere human monarch, but there is a divine personage here that we're confronted with, and that's what Jesus is trying to get us to realize.
Okay, sounds good. And thank you so much, Christine. Glad that you wrote in the question, and glad you're listening in Buffalo, presumably on the Station of the Cross. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. 833-288 EWTN is our phone number, 833-288-3986. Let's go to Ron now in Louisville, listening on Sirius XM 130. Hey, Ron, what's on your mind today?
Yes. I didn't grow up a cradle Catholic. I was just basically a Baptist and converted to Catholicism about 15 years ago. But I know Catholics speak to each other about Our Lady as with every bit of emotion in their heart and stuff, but I think maybe too often they refer to her on, public radio as Our Lady when, they don't refer to the Pope as our guy or our man. And I just think maybe she should be referred to occasionally as in some more respectful term, like our Blessed Mother or something like that.
Oh, sure. I think I understand the question. The concern that you raise, I think, presumes on modern vernacular English, because in modern vernacular English, there's no person in our life to whom this title would be adequate. But a lot of our devotional language about the Blessed Virgin Mary doesn't come from 21st century American vernacular English, but comes from early modern English when it was when England and the European continent, Catholic countries, were very familiar with a society of orders in which there were very distinct class distinctions between nobility and landowners and peasantry and artisans and so forth. And people were accustomed to there being others in the society who were owed special terms of deference in public address. It would be unthinkable to slap a guy on the back from the House of Lords and go, "Hey, buddy, what's going on?" There was a form of address that was expected of you, and you had to, kind of bow and nod the head and genuflect or whatever and say, "My lord, my lady." These were terms of respect and deference to aristocrats. There's a passage in Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila was a Spanish mystic, a nun in the 16th century, who wrote a lot about the life of prayer and the interior life. And but she became very famous in her day because she was such an outstanding guide on spiritual matters. And she became the Mother Superior of a Carmelite Reformed convent and had a great influence in religious life in Spain in the 16th century. And as such, she was sometimes invited to kind of hobnob with the high and mighty. But that's not how she grew up, and she didn't have that custom of speech. She didn't know how you were supposed to behave at court. And in one of her books, she talks about being called into the presence of this high and mighty Spanish noblewoman, and she knew that there was this special form of address that she was supposed to use, and she didn't know it. And so she walks in and basically says, "You're going to have to excuse me. I'm basically a nobody in the real world, you know, and I don't know how I'm supposed to talk to a noblewoman. So will you tell me how I'm supposed to address you?" And the woman laughed it off, said, "Don't worry about it. Let's just talk about God." And on they went. But we don't live in that kind of culture now. We don't live in the kind of society in which we're used to having these formal addresses that we have to use as we address other people. But that's where a lot of the language of Marian devotion comes from a time in the history of the English language or European languages when Our Lady was recognized as a very deferential form of address to someone whose social station was above our own. So it actually is a very respectful way to address the Blessed Virgin Mary. But it's just one that's unfamiliar to modern English vernacular, modern American vernacular.
Sure. Ron, thank you so much for your call. This is Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. We have a line open for you right now, 833-288-3986. Cheryl's checking us out on YouTube. She says, "My question is, even though God's grace increases within us, how are we to understand an increase of God's life within us when he is omnipresent?"
What a wonderful question.
Yeah.
I love these speculative questions about metaphysics and mystical theology.
Great
That's
stuff.
red meat for me. Love
There you
that
go.
kind of thing. Thank you so much. So the mode of God's presence within us when we talk about the increase of grace in us is a quality. All right, it's not a substance, it's a quality. And it is a quality that makes us to be God-like. Now, what is God's nature? God's nature is love.
Yes.
As we grow in grace, we grow in God-likeness. And obviously, it's not God who's changing here. It's we who are changing more and more into his image and likeness. So in that sense, we can speak about grace increasing within us, not as if, not like air increasing the volume of the interior of a balloon. You know, if you keep pumping more air in, the balloon gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
We shouldn't think of grace like that, like some sort of gaseous substance that gets pumped into us. All right, it's not extended in space. It's not a substance of any kind. It is a supernatural quality, making all of our works and character and actions and will more and more and more God-like. Now, the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us that grace is a mystery. Grace escapes our experience. If I take 3 people into a laboratory and put them under the microscope or put them in the MRI machine, grace is not going to show up under that kind of investigation. I'm not going to be able to empirically look at somebody and go, I can see grace. On the other hand, sometimes there's a Rich Jesse's going to appreciate this. Tom Price is probably going to hate it. There's a line from a Grateful Dead song that goes, "Once in a while you get shown the light in the strangest of places if you look at it right,"
Wow.
And that came to me. And if you kind of out of the corner of your eye, when you're not exactly looking, you'll see someone in the Catholic faith, and there's just this quality about them. They just seem to shine,
I see it in your wife.
Yeah, in my wife. That's
And I
a
see
good
it,
example.
and I see it in my wife as well.
Absolutely. And it's kind of hard to pin down. You can't quite put your finger on it, but there's something that just seems to make that person walk about an extra half inch off the ground, and it smells of the Holy Spirit to me. That's all I can, and smell is a metaphor, obviously. And if you meet a holy priest, you meet a holy religious, you meet a holy spouse, and you see, I can't quite get my finger wrapped around what wouldn't show up under a microscope, but there's something that's just beautifying about their character, and it's got to do with how this person lives profoundly in God, And can I prove that in a test tube? No. But I think that we get these little hints and touches of the divine life in those other souls, and we go, you don't need but one of those people in your life in a decade to enliven your faith and keep you going. Very rarely, but you get one or two of those people, and they really keep you going in life. They're what we call saints. They're just magnificent.
Yeah.
That's how grace grows within us. Now, when it comes to the question of God's omnipresence, obviously this doesn't involve omnipresence positively or negatively, right? Because we're not talking about a spatial location. There's a wonderful little book on the presence of God by Anselm Moynihan, OP, Dominican theologian. I highly recommend you read it. And God is omnipresent. We can speak of his omnipresence in a number of different modes. And and Father Moynihan draws these out. One of them, of course, is God's omniscience. He sees all things. All things are present to his divine intellect. He's omnipresent, not in the sense of being extended in space, but in being wholly present in each solitary particle of creation. This is what we talk about God's immensity, that all of God is present in every particle of created matter, maintaining it in being. No decrease, no increase in that, because he's there in whom we live and move and have our being at all times and all places. But we also speak about God being present in us by grace, in this created manner, this gracious quality in the soul, making us more and more God-like. And then he's present in a very, very special way, of course, in the Holy Eucharist, the body and blood, the physical body and blood, as well as the soul and divinity of Jesus Christ being present in that very unique way in the Blessed Sacrament. So all these ways that God can be present without in any way qualifying or calling into question his omnipresence.
Cheryl, thanks so much for your question. Thanks also for checking us out today on YouTube. We're delighted to have you along for the ride. In a moment, we'll get back to the phones. We have a line open for you right now, and I mean it. 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. It is Called to Communion. Stay with us. Glad you're with us. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. If you've been waiting to get through and you can't get through because the lines are busy, guess what? We got a line open for you right now. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We'll get back to the phones here in just a moment. Here is a question from Elaine checking us out on Facebook today. Hello, Elaine. You'll love this, Dr. Anders. She says, please define grace.
Thank you. So the word grace has a number of different senses in the Catholic tradition and in sacred scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to draw some qualifications. The Hebrew word that is often rendered grace when we translate the Old Testament basically refers to God's benign condescension towards us, God's goodwill towards us.
Okay.
And so it really locates something in the divine will, in the divine attitude towards us, God's gracious benevolence towards us. In the New Testament, the word grace has a different significance, and it seems to be used, at least some places, the way the Old Testament writers use it, but in other places it seems to refer to an active principle within us, obviously with its initiative in the divine will, but actually coming to dwell within our hearts. So St. Paul says, for instance, in the Corinthian correspondence, he says, I worked harder than any of them, but not me, the grace of God within me. You see this active principle within the human person. And when we begin to study, what is it that takes place in the new covenant, in the heart, all right, of the new covenant, that makes it qualitatively different from the old covenant? Well, Jeremiah talks about this in Jeremiah 31. He says that in the new covenant, God will take his law and write it on our minds and place it in our hearts. Ezekiel says he'll give us a circumcised heart, change us inside out, make us new men, reformed in the likeness and image of Jesus. And that's that grace that Paul is talking about, that gracious quality within us that from which this wellspring of good works pours forth. And Catholic theologians say, well, trying to understand what that would look like. And they tried on a lot of different theories, throughout the Middle Ages, but what became the dogmatic explanation is that grace within us, that active principle within us, is a share in the divine nature. 2 Peter 1:4 says that through the promises of Christ we become participants in the divine nature, but obviously can't be an immediate participation in the divine essence because we're not God. So it must be in some created manner that we come to be made like him. So that grace, that sanctifying grace, is a supernatural quality implanted in the soul that becomes in us an active principle of meritorious and morally good works as we are reshaped and reformed into the likeness and image of God. That's the principal sense of grace we speak of in the Catholic tradition, that sanctifying grace that makes us like Jesus. But clearly God is graciously active in our lives in other ways as well. So the man who is drawn to even consider the Catholic faith, John chapter 4, Jesus says, no one comes to me but the Father draw him. So even that drawing to consider the truth of the Catholic faith is itself a work of God's grace, but it's not that sanctifying grace that beautifies the soul and makes it like Jesus. So the theologians again draw another distinction. They call that kind of grace actual grace. Actual doesn't mean actual as opposed to fanciful. It means actual as in active.
Okay.
Actively drawing us into some good work or some consideration of the truth of the faith, hopefully all the way to the threshold of the door into holy baptism when we can receive sanctifying grace.
Yes, indeed. Elaine, we hope that's helpful for you. Thank you so much for that kind of a blue sky question, wasn't it? It was a blue sky question.
Oh,
it's
yes.
like, big. Doesn't get much bigger than that.
Right.
All right. Elaine, thanks again. Let's get back to the phones now at 833-288-EWTN. Kara, listening to us in Boston. Hey there, Kara. What's on your mind today?
Quick question for you guys about the St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. So I was reading it probably last week, and volume 5, I think it's question 8, article 1. St. Thomas Aquinas talks about confession, and specifically confession to a priest. I don't have any issue or objection to confessing to a priest, but more so I'm trying to realize or understand what St. Thomas Aquinas is making the parallel. He brings up a gospel, I think it's John 11:44. He talks about Jesus saying that he raises Lazarus from the dead, and then he tells the apostles to unbind Lazarus. And then he says that because they were unable to unbind Lazarus, they'll also be able to forgive sins. And I told a friend this, I was like, I'm very confused what the parallel St. Thomas Aquinas is trying to make here. So I was going to see if you guys could kind of explain that.
Okay, sure.
To me.
So I while we're talking, I'm trying to pull up the article in the Summa that you read. I would need not the volume number, but I would need. Are we talking about the? I assume we're talking about the third part of the Summa. And you said question 5, article 1. Is that what you said?
So it's question 8, article 1.
Oh, sorry, question 8, article 1. And I may not just at the risk of boring people that are sitting listening on the radio, I may not be able to go through this right now. Just here read the Summa and comment on it. But I am going to pull it up and look at it.
Okay.
Let me talk about the Catholic doctrine of confession. Let me do that, and then try and back my way back into Thomas while I'm trying to find this article. So the basis for the power of the Church to forgive sins is the promise of Christ in John chapter 20, when he says, as the Father sends me, so I send you. Receive the Holy Spirit. Whoever sins you forgive are forgiven. Whoever sins you retain are retained. So, Christ states it about as plainly as you can possibly state it. I'm sending you guys in the same way that the Father sent me. Here is the gift of the Holy Spirit so that you have this divine and supernatural power to bind and loose sins. Whoever sins you forgive are forgiven. And then the parallel passages in Matthew 16 and Matthew 18, he says, whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And in chapter 18, it's very obvious that power of binding and loosing comes to play specifically over admitting or excluding people from the fellowship of the church, absolving them and readmitting them to fellowship, or excommunicating them, because he deals with the issue of if you find your brother caught in sin, what do you do? And if they don't repent, he says you take it to the church. And if they won't listen to the church, you kick them out, you excommunicate them. And then Christ gives this, he says this, if whatever 2 or 3 agree in my name, I'm there with you. Whatever you bind on earth, bound in heaven. A lot of people think that means that, if we ask for sunny weather on the kid's birthday, we're going to get it. It actually is the context of ecclesiastical discipline, that Christ actually does give this power of binding and loosing to the church to absolve or to exclude. And then connects it to the power of the forgiveness of sins. We see that in operation in the Corinthian correspondence when St. Paul is dealing with a sinner in Corinth who's sleeping with his stepmother, and he tells the Corinthians, Paul does, he says, this is terrible stuff, kick this guy out till he comes to his senses. Hand him over to Satan is the language that the apostle uses, and then they do so. And then he writes him in 2 Corinthians and says, well done, you got the job done, now the guy's come to his senses, he's repented, readmit him now, and I forgive him in the presence of Christ. Here's Paul exercising that power of binding and loosing and of absolving for sins. I forgive him, he says, in the presence of Christ. And the guy's absolved. He's readmitted to fellowship. And we saw, obviously, that dynamic continues in the 2nd century church. And there was a huge debate that raged in the 2nd century about whether or not the church should exercise that power in every case, because there was a presumption that the converted Christian would live a holy life. Well, what if you have somebody and they off the starting blocks, they look okay, and then like every other week it's a new adultery? Wow. I mean, how long do we put up with this kind of nonsense, I mean, do I just keep forgiving you every week you come back and you just keep doing the same thing over and over again?
Or as we would say these days, come on, man. Come
on, man. Exactly. And there was a kind of a proto-Puritan, if you will, early 2nd century Puritan named Tertullian, Christian writer from North Africa. He writes a book called De Pudicitia, and another one on De Penitentia, on penance and on purity. And he gets all kinds of mad at the Pope. Pope is Pope Calixtus. Tertullian gets all kinds of mad at the Pope, because popes just run around forgiving every Tom, Dick, and Harry every time they sin. And Tertullian goes, man, I know that Christ gave you this power, but for crying out loud, don't you think you ought to be a little bit more selective in exercising it? I mean, these guys aren't even making an effort. One shot. You get one shot at repentance. After that, kick them out. That was Tertullian's position.
One and done.
One and done, man. And Calixtus, it goes, no, we're going with the 70 times 7 that Jesus said. Yeah. Even adultery, murder, apostasy, the biggies. If you're sorry, we're going to forgive you. We might give you a pretty hefty penance. And back in those days, it was a lot worse than 3 Hail Marys.
Oh, yeah.
But we're still going to forgive you and let you back in. Tertullian got so mad he went off and joined the Montanists. He left the Catholic Church over this. But we see that being exercised down through church history. Now, in the Fourth Lateran Council, which takes place in 1215, the church said, this public penance and excommunication that we've been doing, that might not be the most felicitous way to exercise this jurisdiction that Christ has given us. Mm-hmm. So they instituted as mandatory the practice of private confession, so that you're basically doing the deed in private, in your own conscience and before a priest, and you're not making it out public in front of the whole world. And personally, I like that a lot better.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? So that part is new, and that's the regime that Thomas Aquinas grows up under. Thomas was born in 1225. The mandatory auricular confession once a year was instituted in 1215 by the Fourth Lateran Council. Now, I haven't pulled up the passage in the Summa. I'm going to go look at it later, pull it up. My guess is, just from what your description, Thomas goes to this passage in John 11 as an allegory. He's not actually trying to textually base the practice of confession on the resurrection of Lazarus. He's looking at this as an allegory for the unbinding of the soul, to illustrate in a beautiful pictorial way what happens in the spiritual level when priests exercise this power given to them by Christ. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whoever sins you forgive are forgiven.
Okay. Hope that is helpful for you. Kara, thank you so much for listening to us in Boston. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. So did you get a new smartphone for Christmas, or maybe a tablet of some sort? Don't forget to download the free EWTN app. You can listen to any of our programs on demand. Basically, All the shows that we air from early in the morning till late in the evening, they're all available on demand. You can also listen to a live stream of EWTN Radio and check out our television stuff, all the podcasts. It is great. So it's a free download. Go to EWTNapps.com, EWTNapps.com, and get that for your own self, for your smartphone or for your tablet. Back to the phones right now. Here is Mike in Centennial, Colorado, listening on the Catholic Radio Network. Mike, what's on your mind today?
A great show. Bless you guys. Can we earn grace? That's my question.
Thank you. Really appreciate the question. Magnificent question. The answer is yes and no.
Okay.
Yes and no. So sanctifying grace, that grace that makes us adopted children of God and makes us pleasing to Him, so that if we die with sanctifying grace in our souls, we go to heaven and live with Christ forever. The initial reception of that sanctifying grace is something that we cannot earn. We cannot earn that. And we cannot compel God to grant it. However, once granted, once we enter into that life of sanctifying grace and adoptive sonship, if we cooperate with that grace once received, then we can merit an increase in that grace. We can grow in that grace and become more and more godly, more and more holy, more and more united to Him if we freely cooperate. And in a mode that will actually result in reward in heaven. So Jesus talks about this. He says, if you give even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones because they believe in me, you will not lose your reward. And Jesus talks all the time about reward. So there's definitely reward for good works done in grace. And one of them is a growth in grace. Grace being its own reward, because there's no greater reward than a share in God's very own divine nature. So we can merit increase in grace in that sense. Cannot merit that initial grace. Now, however, although we cannot merit that initial gift of grace, we can prepare for it, and we can, if you will, place ourselves in its path. All right, and let me explain. So, if you are hanging around the Catholic Church and its sacraments, but let's say you don't have faith, but you see the sense in having faith. You say, would that I had faith. Would that I had faith. Would that my life makes sense. Would that my life had that kind of beauty about it that I see that Catholic fellow that I'm friends with has. I wish I could live that kind of life. I just can't. I just can't see it. I can't see the thing clearly. But you start hanging around the Catholic Church. You start reading the right books. You start making the right friends. And you say that prayer like there's a science fiction writer named John C. Wright. He was a hardened atheist. Didn't believe in God at all. He'd all the arguments about God worked out. He says, I absolutely don't believe in God. Doesn't happen. No proof works. Not convinced. But you know what? Just as a scientific experiment, God, I know you don't exist, but if you do, show me. Signing off, John C. Wright. This is his own autobiography. I've got no way to verify this independently. This is a story that he tells.
Okay.
Next thing he knows, well, I'll let you read the story, but he basically drops dead of a heart attack, and they revive him, and he comes out the other end, and he's had some kind of mystical experience, and he goes, okay, well, I got that question answered. And now he's a Catholic apologist, right?
Wow.
Now, I'm not vouching that experience is veridical or true or whatever, but that's just an illustration of the kind of, hey, I don't even believe this stuff, but I'm putting myself in the path to have an encounter if such a thing is possible. Well, it's not surprising that when people start hanging around the church and her sacraments and her books and authors and teachers and doctors and spending time in front of the Blessed Sacrament, or that they're putting themselves in the path of grace.
Absolutely.
And you're a lot more likely to have an encounter with grace if you're hanging around where grace is to be found, hanging around the fountain, so to speak, than if you're not. And so the Council of Trent says that we can prepare. There is a remote preparation for grace that we can engage in, even though we cannot compel the hand of God to give it to us. Now, does that mean that if we fail to do that preparation that we won't receive grace? No. And the model here, the paradigm, of course, is St. Paul. He's like, I'm going to go kill me some Christians.
Yeah.
Strap on my 6-shooters. I'm marching down the road. I'm going to go blow some heads up. And next thing you know, Jesus appears to him and says, Paul, what are you doing?
Kaboom.
Kaboom. And Paul turns around, does a 180. So grace can reach you, though you are running from it with all of your strength, like Francis Thompson's great poem, the Hound of Heaven. He's running away from grace, and grace lays hold of him anyway.
Love that. Mike, thank you so much for your call. In a moment here, we're going to get to Jeff in Cleveland, Ohio. So, Jeff, sit tight for me. First of all, Julie, listening to Sacred Heart Radio in Wenatchee, Washington, has this question. She says, this is regarding the Protestant idea that good works are an automatic result of true faith. How do they defend this idea? How do they simultaneously hold that works have no impact on salvation?
Thanks. It all depends on which Protestants you ask. And they don't answer the question consistently. So, but the dilemma that you have, so this is deep embedded in the heart of Protestant spirituality, in my view, is this question of what is the relationship of my own good works to the assurance of my salvation. And in 17th century Puritanism, this thing really split the Puritan movement right down the middle. Because there were some people that took the position that they said, well, look, maybe our works don't save us, but if you really have true faith, you're going to have good works. The so-called syllogismus practicus, all right, the practical syllogism. If grace, then good works. So if you got good works, it's evidence that you've had grace. Or no good works, no grace. That's how they reasoned. And so there was a wing of Puritanism that really insisted strongly on the evidential value of moral behavior. And the absence of moral behavior being a kind of a disqualifier that, if you're not living the way you're supposed to, you obviously haven't really been born again. That's the way, at least the way they reasoned. But then there was another party that said, look, all our works are filthy rags. Even with grace, we can't really merit anything from God. Our works are hateful to God. I mean, that's also a Protestant doctrine. So you really can't infer from the presence of moral behavior that a person has grace. And this is the so-called antinomian controversy that racked New England. Anne Hutchinson, a female teacher in 17th century Puritan New England, famous for advocating this antinomian position that you can't infer anything from good works. And it didn't end well for Hutchinson. She got run out of town by the Puritan authorities, and I think her family was killed by Indians or something.
Really?
And she had, bad situation. It didn't end well for her. And the Puritans were like, see, that's evidence. They took it as evidence that she was a heretic. But Hutchinson's opinion, I think, ultimately won out. In modern evangelicalism, fundamentalism, you're much more likely to find a more antinomian approach to this question than the hardline Puritan moralists. But in my own life, having been raised in that tradition before I was Catholic, I can speak to a kind of internal bipolar condition where you would say, how do I know I'm really saved? Well, I've got these good works, but my good works are as filthy rags, so I can't infer anything from them. But I guess I'll have to get thrown back on my faith, just to rely on my faith. But how do I know I have real faith? Well, does it eventuate in good works? And you just kind of go around in this endless cycle, chasing the tail of this introspective. And then you go, I know I'm saved, I know I'm saved, I know I'm saved. I'm not really saved, I'm not really saved, I'm not really saved. Which is why a buddy of mine once said that the Puritan elect know for sure they're going to heaven, and I might be one of them. And I really think there's no way out of that donut. I really don't think you get out of that except by just asserting a position and sticking to it just arbitrarily, unless you get out of that paradigm altogether and you avail yourself of the beauty of the Catholic sacrament of confession. Because it's not about me trying to discern the inner vagaries of my interior life. It's about me hanging on to the objective word of promise pronounced by Christ's minister, I absolve you. Not you might be absolved, but I absolve you. You are absolved.
No sweeter words.
Through the ministry of the church, I absolve you. What that guy binds on earth is bound in heaven. And when I first recognized that, my own experience in the confessional blew me away. And I went, all my life I'd been taught that Catholics were neurotic nut jobs who lacked real assurance of salvation. Now I see that I had that equation exactly backwards. I was the neurotic nut job for 33 years until I was released by the power of Christ's promise and the sacrament of confession.
And there's a story with a happy ending. Appreciate your question there, Julie, and glad that you're listening to us today here on Call to Communion. Let's go to Jeff now in Cleveland, listening on Living Bread Radio. Jeff, what's on your mind today?
Good afternoon. I want to talk about ancient cultures, pre-Abraham. All of these cultures, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Incas, Mesopotamians, globally across the planet, all engaged in human and or child sacrifice as a way to appease their gods. And troubling that maybe the Hebrews were involved with this because they knew the God, the right God, and the one God. And so any insight you might have and any thoughts on, can you imagine the first guy that came up with the idea, let's take your child and kill him so the wind stops blowing or something like that? What were these people thinking? How did they get the idea of killing someone else, and why didn't God stop it?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. It's a fascinating topic that you raise, and one I've thought about quite a bit. So most ancient cultures, as you know, are animistic, and animism tends to be kind of like the base religious consciousness of pre-civilized human organizations, which is just a knee-jerk tendency to ascribe personality and agency to natural events. So that you see behind the wind or disease or whatnot, there must be some spirit or agency behind that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you because that's the only mode of explanation that comes immediately to one's experience. They don't have empirical methods, and they don't have mathematics, and they don't have all these tools of natural philosophy that human civilizations will eventually develop. So it's an infantile way of thinking about cause and effect, but one that is intelligible within a certain level of primitive culture. Just ascribe every event to some sort of agency. Well, if you live in that kind of tribal society, it's hierarchical, and to a certain extent, might makes right within your own circle of relations.
Mm-hmm.
And so relations of patronage and dependence and satisfaction and loyalty and fealty and punishment would be part and parcel of your daily experience. If you've read about some of these primitive cultures, very based in those kinds of social relations. And, you want to appease the chief, you're probably going to go out and kill a pig and bring it to him. Or maybe you're going to give him your daughter. I mean, people are property a lot of times.
Yeah.
And so I can understand how it would be intelligible to a person to transfer that kind of thinking to those unseen forces or agencies with which they're interacting. Now, of course, it's abominable. It's abominable in the Hebraic mind. Now, you're correct. Hebrews themselves were implicated in this kind of behavior. We know the Phoenicians engaged in it. The Carthaginians were related to the Phoenicians. We found mass human graves of sacrificial victims in North Africa from the Carthaginian era.
Mm-hmm.
And the Old Testament talks about this, but the Hebrew prophets, of course, condemn it. They say this is reprehensible. You should not do this thing, and so the ruling out human sacrifice was at one in the prophetic mind with the doctrine of the unity of God. Monotheism was at the same time also a defense of the dignity of human persons created in the likeness and image of God. And that's, the Hebrew prophetic mindset was more than a cut above their pagan neighbors. Now, as civilization develops around the world, I mean, not just Hebrew civilization, but Greek and Chinese, Indian, and others, you begin to see a gradual move away. Not entirely. You still find some human sacrifice, actually, even in the modern world, but a gradual move away, a tendency to kind of spiritualize or allegorize some of those events, and then look for more monocausational explanations for natural phenomena, and a growth of culture tending towards monotheism. And I'd love to take that up at another time. There's a great book on the topic you might want to read, though, by Rodney Stark, the sociologist. I think it's called The Discovery of God, The Invention of God, The Finding of God, The Something of God. I can't remember.
Okay.
But Rodney Stark, and he tracks this passage from this pre-modern animistic way of thinking towards an emergence of monotheism in cultures around the world at about the time of the Axial Age. So, good book. Might be interested in that.
Very cool. We'll check that out. Thank you so much for your call, Jeff. Dr. David Anders, thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Tom.
Be sure and